Good morning, Rokaya. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, good morning.
How are you, Michelle?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling better today. I have a few more tests to go, but otherwise all good. Is Sarah, is that you? Your name appears as Rokaya.
Yes, because I gave her my link.
Okay. I mean, maybe you can manually edit it. Is that Rokaya? Is that you or Sarah? The one with this?
I'm the one with my picture.
Okay, cool.
And I think Sarah can just rename herself.
You're muted, Sarah.
We can't hear you.
How's everyone?
Good.
Good.
Slightly sick, but managing. But who isn't these days, right? So
Right. Sarah, we've shared on Teams just to document what sort of the talking points that we agreed on, and also the visual, or the ones with the circles with the overview.
Right.
So we'll share the overview in the chat because Michelle and I don't really trust our Mac computers to be able to share on Zoom our
Might be able to do it. I mean,
But if you trust your computer, then please do share that visual overview, just to give them, the numbers and the sessions, since we're not going to go one by one.
I think I should be able to do that. I don't want to overhype myself. You never know, it might be possible.
Exactly. 2 years in with Zoom and Teams, and I still face problems, so I'm not trusting it.
right.
My biggest problem is accessing downloads. I always forget how to do this. It's ridiculous. But now it's small. That's weird. Can you send it in an email, Rokaya? Because from Teams, it's just, unless I can save it. Okay. Okay, wait a minute. It should be saved. But yeah, and let's just all put stuff in the chat. Can you be ready to put the global? Why is it not there?
I can put the link to the human rights dashboard and encourage colleagues to follow up updates.
Yeah, we'll do that at the end, but if we can put a link to the actual report.
Yeah, I have that ready.
Yeah, that's because that's different from the okay, save. So why can't I open it?
Ezgi, do you have the right link? Because we actually
I've updated that one.
Okay.
Michelle reached out to me yesterday.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
No worries, of course. We have a few colleagues joining. Will you be sharing your screens, either of you, Rokaya? I missed that part.
Rokaya, can you just send me this slide on an email? Because I
just did. Yeah.
I can't open it. I don't know what the problem is.
I just sent it to you. Should get there in a second. No, I'm not sharing my screen. I don't trust that. So Sarah will try to do that.
Okay.
You're gonna get me to do it, and I'm not. Yeah. Okay.
And if not, then we'll just share it in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. I'm gonna let colleagues in slowly. They're not so.
Yeah, just let everybody in. It's fine.
Okay. And Sarah, you will be opening and moderating, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Tim is here as well. Good morning, Tim.
Hi, Tim. You're muted.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
You have a very nice background.
I'm glad you enjoy it.
Nice to see you as well, but you also have a nice background.
Background is terrible. I know.
Okay, let's give it a few more minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. We'll just give it another minute or two for colleagues to come in and we'll start soon.
Hi, Aparna. Thanks for joining.
Hello.
Okay, in the interest of time, Sarah, maybe we should slowly start.
Yep.
Okay, obviously.
Absolutely. Hi, good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning for this briefing about UNDP's engagement at the Human Rights Council. I think we're expecting a few more people to arrive, but we want to get started because we're only meeting for a very short time today. Firstly, my name is Sarah Rattray. I work in the global team on rule of law and security and human rights, and my colleagues will also introduce themselves when they take the floor. But the purpose of the discussion this morning is really to brief you about what has just UNDP's perspective and strategic engagement at the recently concluded session of the Human Rights Council, the 50th session, which ran from the 13th of June until the 8th of July. So it's just concluded. There is a UNDP executive summary and report from the session, and I'm going to ask one of the colleagues to put it in the chat. It's available on our Global Human Rights Spark Blue page. So for colleagues who haven't seen it, it was distributed widely yesterday, but if you could put the link in the chat, Michelle or Rakaya, that would be appreciated. Before we get into the what occurred at the Council and what UNDP did and our perspectives from it, just to explain, I'm sure colleagues on the call are very familiar with the Human Rights Council, but just briefly, you know, the Council does meet 3 times a year. For the first session in February, March, the second is the summer session, which is just concluded, and then there's also a session in October. It meets for a period of 3 to 4 weeks. It's a subsidiary body of the United Nations, of the General Assembly, but of course it's the main body in the UN system, the intergovernmental body, which looks consistently at various different human rights issues, both country contexts, technical cooperation, thematic issues, and the council sessions themselves are an opportunity to dive into all of those topics that I've just mentioned, and there's also trends and topics that come up, you know, over periods of time because of interconnectivity between sessions. And of course, there's also important resolutions that come from the Council, which are tantamount to soft law for the United Nations and provide direction for our work. And of course, recommendations to member states. UNDP's role at the Council, we obviously are focused very much on the development and human rights intersection and development perspective on the Human Rights Council. We bring to bear a lot of our research, a lot of our work at country office level, a lot of our policy work. In this most recent council, UNDP was referred to in 24 of the reports that were discussed, our work in various different ways. We also bring perspectives, again, from our work to the council discussions. So we've done that through, we do that through various ways, mostly statements that we provide from the floor to particular topics. And of course, we also monitor and track key sessions that are of interest to UNDP, to the Global Policy Network, and also to the regional bureaus, for instance, country situations, country contexts. And of course, there can be sensitive topics that are discussed that are of interest to UNDP, and we also track them and include them in the executive summary and the reports that we provide. So our goals really are to bring UNDP's perspective and our work to the human rights and development discourse that occurs at the Council, to be able to relay back to UNDP the important directions that are coming from the Council, the flavour of the discussions, any key points that are relevant also to UNDP, and lastly, to prompt internal discussion in UNDP on the intersection of human rights and development. And that's really why we engage at the Council and what we're hoping to achieve with our Council engagement. So with that, I'm going to hand over firstly to Rukaya, who's going to brief on some aspects for a few minutes, and then Michelle. And then we're really pleased to have Tim from the NCE team with us, because one of the panel discussions that UNDP participated in this last Council session was linked to climate change. So it's good to hear a perspective of someone who isn't necessarily living and breathing the day-to-day of Council engagement, but is very strongly working on human rights issues and has brought the perspective of UNDP's work to that dialogue. So we're really pleased that you can join us today, Tim. Please put any questions you've got in the chat, any observations. This is an informal briefing, so anything that you want to highlight or that isn't clear, or any ideas you have, they're most welcome to take the floor or put it in the chat. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Rukaya, who should introduce herself first, I think. Thanks, Rukaya.
Thanks, Sarah. So my name is Rukaya Daif, and I'm a human rights specialist based in Geneva, and I'm part of the Rule of Law, Human Rights and Security team, the global team. So before I go into the thematic highlights, I'd just like to give a few numbers, and I think we'll try to share an overview to give you an idea of UNDP's engagement at the Council. As mentioned by Sarah, UNDP was referenced in 24 reports, and we have a list of these reports and the references if interested, including the references were included in reports, for example, on the right of IDPs, on human rights mainstreaming, women's rights, peaceful protests, SDGs on racism, and there's a long list. We provided 4 statements from the floor, and I'll go more into details into these in a minute. They were about business and human rights, climate change, on the High Commissioner's annual report, and also on good governance. And then UNDP was mentioned in one resolution, which is on the situation of human rights of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar, and we'll get to that as well later. So on the thematic sessions, as mentioned by Sarah, we follow very closely a list of sessions that we think are of interest and are relevant for UNDP. But I would like to highlight those where we provided a statement or where UNDP was referenced. So the first one is during the High Commissioner's annual report and the discussion on that, where the High Commissioner usually provides an update on the situation of human rights in different countries, and highlights also some thematic issues of significance. And at this session, she highlighted 3 areas of intervention that are needed to advance human rights. And these include tackling rising inequalities, expanding social protection, and international cooperation and solidarity. And here, UNDP's statement was focused on highlighting the potential of human rights as a problem-solving tool for development challenges. And we also emphasized our partnership with OHCHR to strengthen the integration of human rights and development, and also our work to support national human rights institutions. Another key highlight, a thematic highlight, was a strong statement by the Special Rapporteur on racism. The Special Rapporteur presented her report on SDGs on racism, which concludes that the 2030 agenda for the SDGs is characterized by a shallow commitment to racial justice and equality, and fails to address systemic racism and xenophobia. And she also provided some solutions or progress that can be taken towards racial justice, which requires, for example, adequate resources, racially disaggregated data, political will, and more representative institutions. And her report makes reference to UNDP. So this was particularly interesting for us because the report makes reference to UNDP's operations and programming, and also reflects on the work done at various task forces internally. But also it specifically asks UNDP for a more structured and robust approach to racial equality. So the special rapporteur is advising UNDP to adopt a racial equality strategy and be more proactive in integrating a race-sensitive lens to our programming. So that was very important to follow. And then a third thematic highlight, which I would like to mention, is on business and human rights, which was discussed at an interactive dialogue and focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, the chair of the working group shared some positive measures adopted by states to support businesses to mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19 on human rights, but also raised concerns related to corporate human rights abuses in specific sectors. And we also provided a statement here expressing our continued cooperation with the working group on business and human rights to help businesses play a constructive role in the recovery of COVID-19. And we also shared the support that we provide to governments in drafting national action plans on business and human rights, as well as our support to businesses on human rights due diligence. And after we provided the statement, the chair actually thanked UNDP for its work and collaboration with the working group, which was great because this was a chance to position UNDP in front of member states and delegates and our donors, and really to share our work with everyone. So that was a great recognition to get. And then lastly, I'd like to highlight the panel on good governance, which focused on good governance in response to COVID-19. And the panel discussion focused specifically on the most efficient ways of using new technologies in the context of the pandemic. And the panel also underlined the positive impacts of new technologies. It was a very interesting discussion because we've seen from the different previous sessions and this session that new technologies are a recurring issue that is being discussed. And here UNDP delivered a statement from the floor as well, which called attention to UNDP's partnership approach in building empowering digital ecosystems based on accountable and inclusive governance, and also mentioned the 580 digital enabled program responses to COVID-19 that we have. So these are some of the highlights. There are many other thematic issues that were discussed and are included in our report, which you can access. We'll share the link to those. So I think I'll stop here, Sarah. Hand over to you.
Thanks, Rakaya. Yeah, as Rakaya said, I mean, the council discusses so many different topics. It's not possible for us to follow every single one, and that's not our objective. We're trying to particularly follow key discussions that we think are relevant for UNDP teams. And just for your information, colleagues, before the council, the agendas are circulated to all the team leaders and colleagues across the house to ask if they have particular interest in topics. So if there is a topic that you are interested in following at the council, you can always request us to give you some analysis of the topic and the discussions that are ongoing prior to each of the sessions. So thanks, Rakaya. Over to Michelle on some of the key country discussions. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I'm Michelle Becker. I'm the intern in the Global Human Rights team. I'm working directly with Rakaya here in Geneva, so we got to attend the Human Rights Council in person. And in addition to the thematic sessions, we also followed some country-specific sessions on the countries where there's UNDP programming. There were quite a few, as you can probably imagine, but I'll be focusing on 3. just to give you a brief overview about the highlights. The first one is Afghanistan. As you all know, since the takeover of the Taliban in August of last year, the human rights situation in Afghanistan has become a lot more problematic, and especially women's and children's rights are severely restricted. So the High Commissioner gave an oral update on the situation, on the intersecting humanitarian economic crises, the rising poverty, the ban on schooling on girls. And then there was also an urgent debate initiated by France on women's and girls' rights, where the severe restrictions on movement, freedom of access to the labor market, education, public services for women was particularly highlighted. These concerns about the human rights backsliding in Afghanistan are, of course, of very high concern for UNDP as well, as these reverse decades of development and decades of UNDP work in the country. Various delegates also highlight the need to act now to really help this backsliding of development progress and the shrinking of civic space. Like I said, it tends to reverse and inhibit UNDP's work in the field, as UNDP in the country focuses a lot on partnerships with CSOs and NGOs, which are increasingly restricted in their work. So it's very important here that so this session was very important for UNDP to kind of get more insight into the situation and where UNDP's work can really help the people on the ground. And then there was also a resolution adopted on women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan, which calls upon the de facto government to ease the restrictions and reopen schools. The second highlight would be, of course, Ukraine as a very, very pertinent topic these days. There were two sessions. We're of course closely following the situation as it progresses. And we also provided a statement during the previous council session on Ukraine. In this one, there was an oral update on Mariupol, a besieged city in Ukraine, with a very, very dire humanitarian situation. And the UN agencies are very restricted in their access to the area. Nevertheless, UNDP is on the ground working with the government of Ukraine as well as possible to provide relief to these people. And then there was also the interim report of the Secretary General on Crimea and other occupied areas in Ukraine was also presented, which particularly highlighted the severely restricted freedom of expression, the attacks on media workers, which all lead to a backsliding of the rule of law in these territories. UNDP is operating in some government-controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk, but the access to the occupied areas is generally, as you can imagine, difficult or even impossible at times. So UNDP currently is focusing on economic recovery and the reconstruction of critical infrastructure that was destroyed by the war. Then the last highlight we would like to share from the country-specific session was on Myanmar. There was a panel on root causes, which emphasized the various cultural, political, economic, and historical reasons for the genocide and the displacement. And most importantly, this panel highlighted a development gap that needs to be addressed to tackle these root causes and also to tackle the general underdevelopment of the area, so refugees and displaced people would be able to return safely if they so choose. There was also an update on the oral, so there was an oral progress report by the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. He focused specifically on the impact on children, displaced children, and urged the international community to support the displaced people and to ensure that human rights are met, so food, water, sanitation, education, all those things that displaced people would need in their camps, but also in their return. Importantly, there was a resolution at the end of the session that was adopted on Myanmar, which calls upon the government, of course, to stop all human rights violations, but it also mentioned UNDP. So UNDP, Myanmar, and UNHCR had signed a memorandum of understanding on assistance in the repatriation process. So this is, of course, a key point now for UNDP to promote the safe, dignified, voluntary and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees. And again, here it's very important that the underdevelopment in the area would be tackled to ensure that people can return in a dignified way. And then just quickly on some of the other resolutions and appointments of mandate holders, 24 resolutions were adopted, and there were several resolutions on the country-specific context, like I already mentioned, but also on Sudan and Belarus. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur in Belarus was extended due to the ongoing HR violations, which were also discussed in a separate session. And then there were some resolutions on fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, peaceful protests, of course, of calling upon states to respect those rights. But interestingly, these resolutions focused also a lot on the online sphere, that those rights are also respected in the digital sphere, and that that media literacy would be needed to exercise those rights. And this is also going to be a focus on the upcoming Human Rights Council session in a few months. All of these resolutions are available online. The links are shared in the executive summary, as well as on the Spark Blue page that we have already shared in the chat. So feel free to take a look at those. Having said that, some of those resolutions are still in the raw format on the extranet of the Human Rights Council, so they might not be easily available, but they will become available in the coming days.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that overview. Just to mention, this isn't the first time the UNDP UNHCR partnership has been mentioned in the resolution on Myanmar. So we mentioned in a number of previous resolutions, and it's a consistent theme. There was no further elaboration on this resolution beyond what was in previous resolutions, just to clarify. There's a summary of some of the key resolutions in the executive summary, which pulls out some of these key points Michelle talked about and also extrapolates a little bit more on some of them. So colleagues, if you have questions about any of these sessions, resolutions, any thoughts, ideas, please share them with us in the chat or indicate that you want to take the floor briefly. In the meantime, let's go to Tim. One of the high-level panel discussions this year was on the effects of climate change on vulnerable individuals and vulnerable groups. Obviously, as UNDP is doing extensive work in this space, the NCE team had interest to present their perspective on the discussion in the high-level panel. There was also an important additional discussion on climate change and a specific resolution on climate change with a focus on the right to food, which has other elements to it. But can we hear from you, Tim, about your engagement, why this mattered to the NCE team to engage? I want to ask you that because we're trying to encourage other teams to engage, to share their perspectives too, so it'd be really nice to hear that and your perspective on the session. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Again, let me start by saying it was a great opportunity, not only for what we as an institution got out of it, but also internally, just the opportunity to connect the dots more and work even closer together. So a little bit of information about the panel. High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet opened up that kind of gave the background on what the links are between climate change and human rights. And as many of us know, as the climate changes and natural disasters increase and public policies and private policies change, there's a growing impact on all the groups that UNDP and our partners care about, and all the rights. So the right to a safe and healthy environment, of course, that very much involves the right to health, the right to food, the right to self-determination, and other basic fundamental human rights. And these rights are affected for Indigenous people and local communities, for women, for youth, for people with disabilities, for migrant workers, and other groups of special interest that UNDP, for whom we are here to support as part of the Leave No One Behind and inequalities and poverty reduction work. Michelle Bachelet also talked about a human rights-based approach to climate finance. There were other speakers, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, and the Council was an opportunity to strengthen partnerships and hear from people from Indigenous communities, island nations, youth and climate change activists, environmental defenders who all share their experiences. So all of this is very useful for our team, for broadening our network and for strengthening those partnerships. So UNDP's intervention, and this is another way that our engagement was quite useful. It allowed us to share with the broader council audience some of the work that UNDP is doing. So we talked about things like our collective, it's not just the NCE team, the Nature, Climate, Energy team, but our collective GPN engagement with public, private, and civil society partners to integrate human rights and stakeholder voices into national policies. And so we highlighted what some of you know are the nationally determined contributions, also known as NDCs, and UNDP's initiative called the Climate Promise. We highlighted UNDP's direct support to local communities to ensure the right to a healthy environment, in line with all the global conventions and agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, and what some of you may know is the emerging global framework on biodiversity. And we highlighted our work to strengthen procedural rights to meaningful participation in decision-making and access to information and justice, particularly for those groups at risk or in marginalized contexts. And finally, we used the council meeting as a chance to talk about our more global level work with sister agencies, OHCHR and UNEP, among others, through such initiatives as the human rights, the work around the Human Rights Council itself, but also the Secretary General's call to action on human rights and climate change, where, as some of you know, we're developing UN system-wide resources on this topic to inform not only UNDP's country programming, but the broader work of resident coordinators and UN country teams. So all of that was really useful to broader work that's going on in UNDP with our partners in UN system and beyond. Sarah, in the time I have left, I'd just like to show one other way that our engagement was useful. As we know, the right to a healthy environment has, of course, already been recognized by many, many governments at the national and regional level. But the council meeting and its resolution from a few months ago on this right has really strengthened the normative base that underpins all of our climate and linked nature and energy work. So in ways similar to the 2020 agenda, the council resolution and UNDP's engagement with the council has really, it's catalyzed even more momentum and raised awareness in ways that opens up new doors for collaboration for our advocacy work, for our policy work and programming work. So in other words, it just really strengthens legitimacy of our existing climate and human rights work. And it also opens up new opportunities, particularly with our funding partners, to scale this work. So let me stop there. And as Sarah, as you mentioned, I'm happy to discuss any of these points more. So back to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's great to hear. I want to mention the member states that are engaged at the Council have mentioned to UNDP, including, of course, many of our donor partners, that they always pay attention to these statements that are made by the UN system. It's an important way for us to message, to demonstrate our work, but also to mention the direction of our work. So it's important, particularly in areas where we're very, strongly positioned, that we're represented in these discussions. And often, of course, we're also part of panels themselves, but we have opportunities to provide these statements from the floor. And the Council was for a long time in an online format because of COVID-19, but now it's mostly moving back to in-person. Our colleagues from the Geneva office, Rukaya, Michelle, and of course the director of the Geneva office are always happy to provide the statements on behalf of teams, or of course they can also be delivered by teams themselves. So that's how essentially that delivery system works for these important UNDP perspectives. So one other panel that happened in the council session was on good governance. This is a panel that's taken place previously, and it's had specific thematic focuses. And this year it related to good governance in the context of COVID-19 support and recovery, and specifically looked at digital solutions and digital efforts to support digital service delivery and digital perspectives on the COVID-19 recovery. So another one of the statements, as Rukaya mentioned, was a coordinated statement from the governance group, including our team and the governance team and the Chief Digital Office on our digital work, essentially supporting countries as they recover out of COVID-19. So we've been doing, obviously, I think, as we all know, a tremendous amount of work in this space. And we were also able to relay that in this panel discussion, which I think was an important perspective, considering I think we're certainly the leading entity on the ground working on these issues. I think we have someone from the Chief Digital Office in case he wants to add any points. Jamie, please introduce yourself and thanks.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Thanks very much. Very nice to meet you all. Not much else to add. Just looking through the statements and hearing your feedback. It's fantastic to see UNDP's positioning on these issues and intersecting digital and human rights, as you say. It's great to see that we're one of the kind of leading UN entities on these issues. Hopefully, we can continue to strongly position us going forward. I see that the Special Rapporteur Khan was emphasizing the need around media and digital literacy, in particular for women and girls, closing that digital divide. So hopefully we can, as we focus on these areas a lot through our work, can have more to say on that in the coming councils as well. And thank you for working so closely with us on this, Sarah, and everyone else.
Thanks, Jamie. As Jamie mentioned, this is an ongoing theme, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. There's the issue of the digital divide and the human rights implications have been consistent themes in the Council, including some key resolutions on the rights, human rights in the digital space and in relation to freedom of association and expression. There was another resolution in this Council that touched on this, but didn't actually bring much new to the previous resolutions on this topic. But the Council has been on the front foot on this issue and really making, looking at the human rights implications, of course, but emphasizing that human rights exist in the online and in the offline space equally, and how to promote participation. There's also an important issue in relation to human rights defenders who are facing restricting civic space online, and the Council's been quite seized of that issue. There's been a number of important discussions on that, and that came up this session, but has also come up in previous sessions. So colleagues can also look to previous summaries that are also available on the global space. Maybe if you could just add a link to the global space, not necessarily the post for this last report, that would be great. And I'm just going to mention something about that as well towards the end. We only have about 10 minutes left, colleagues, so if you have any questions or any observations you want to share, please just take the floor, or you can certainly put your comment in dark blue. We have one quick question for you, Tim, I think, in relation to best practice actions and the work that you were speaking to that UNDP emphasised in the panel. So if you have any resources or any observations there, Tim, back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to make sure I understand the question. So is it best practices on how we're integrating the right into our programming, or I just want to make sure I get it right before I answer?
Well, if Katerina's here, but she can take the floor and ask the question herself, would be great to hear from you, Katerina. I think you're joining us from Guinea-Bissau this morning, if that's correct. Yeah. Katerina, are you can you access perhaps?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Katerina from Guinea-Bissau, from UNDP Guinea-Bissau. Yeah, I would like to know if you, the colleague, have some examples of the best practice in those countries they talk about. Because here we have a lot of violation of the human rights and human rights. And then this share of the best practice will help us also to see or to make some work to reduce the human rights violation. That is my question. And thank you for the presentation. Over.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Katerina. That's an excellent question. I suggest, I'll share some thoughts now, but I suggest that we follow up after this call so that we can share, make sure we're getting you the right information and share much more detailed information. So human rights violations can be very specific cases, of course, and they can be just the general deprivation and marginalization that happens over a long period of time. So on both those types of human rights violations, there are many different types of examples that we could share. We could share the examples. I'm just kind of giving you a menu that we can follow up on afterwards. We can talk about, the broader engagement with stakeholders through national policies like the nationally determined contributions, examples of how we ensure that engagement. We can share other examples of how we work at the local level to ensure community engagement. We can also share some examples of working with national human rights institutions and their role in both kind of mitigating and responding to specific cases of human rights violations. So depending on which ones are of those types of and other types of work that we're doing are most useful for your work, happy to set up a dedicated call and to share, bring in other colleagues who can share more detailed information. But excellent question and looking forward to following up with you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for joining us, Katerina, and for that question. I want to make 3 final points, but we still have a few minutes if anyone has any observations or questions or general comments about the Human Rights Council and what UNDP is doing there, and now's the time to ask those questions. In the meantime, I'll just make a couple of other observations. The Council also appoints, well, the process of confirmation, let's say, of the special procedure mandate holders also occurs at the Council. These are the special rapporteurs, the independent experts, the colleagues who sit on the various working groups. And there were 8 appointments in this last Council session. The link is in the chat and you can see the appointments to these offices. Many of these office holders are very important for UNDP because we interact with them. They're obviously independent and they're experts, but we interact with them in many different ways on our global policy work and on our, advisory, sometimes on country work and so on. So you can look and see some of those new appointees. There's some quite interesting ones and many whom I know UNDP has strong and productive relationships with, which is always helpful. And the second thing I want to mention is, and we're not going to go into that in this briefing because it really deserves its own separate briefing, but there were also a number of adoptions of universal periodic review outcomes and recommendations for countries. So the 12 countries where the adoption took place are also in the chat, and many of them, of course, not all of them, but many of them are program countries for UNDP. And the UPR is, of course, the process of review that the countries undertake every 4 years by the Council, by their peers, by peer countries at the Council. And it culminates in a number of recommendations to countries on how they can improve their human rights record and their human rights, their obligations on human rights. And these are very important recommendations for the UN system and also for UNDP. A lot of them relate to the SDGs, many of them do, and many of them also create political space for UNDP to engage in many of these issues and opportunities also for civil society and for partners at country level, national human rights institutions and other partners. So it's always important our country offices are aware of these UPR recommendations when they come out, and hopefully, of course, there will be discussion in the UN country team on these recommendations. But the countries and the link to those recommendations are also in the chat. And if there's nothing else, I also just want to point to the global human rights space on Spark Blue, which the link is also in the chat. This is a space where basically human rights work and developments are updated in general, but there's also a corner specifically on the Human Rights Council. And there's a tag in Spark Blue for the Council. So if you go on the space or if you star the tag, like the tag, I'm not sure the right word, you should receive updates in your Spark Blue feed or how and when you access Spark Blue. You can access that at any time, and as I say, it includes general updates on work on human rights, new publications and new pieces of policy work and other spaces for discussions, but particularly on the Council, that's there. So I'll just wait 10 seconds to see if anybody else has any more questions or observations, and if not, we'll close a couple of minutes early, which is great. Tim, go ahead.
I'd love to hear other voices, but just since we have an extra minute, and maybe you want to share it too, Sarah, I just wanted to mention the upcoming General Assembly resolution. Very exciting. I don't know if you want to share the news, or I'll let you compliment, but basically the Human Rights Council already passed an amazing resolution on the right to a healthy environment, which was the topic that we talked about just now. Even more exciting will be a General Assembly resolution with all, that greater oomph behind it, basically covering the same right with a bit more detail, which is even better. with the support of countries like the US and many others. That's coming up at the end of this month. You're looking at the 28th of July for that to be passed. Really exciting. UNDP will be behind it in terms of advocacy and messaging. And Sarah, maybe you want to say a couple other words about that exciting milestone.
Just, it's a very exciting opportunity, as you said, Tim. I think the council resolution in October was a real landmark, and something, of course, that we were also supporting advocacy-wise, but this is a member state process, of course. Since then, the resolution's been relied on in various means at country level in discussions on accountability and other things, so it's already proven its worth, let's say, in terms of action. But the General Assembly, which of course is the most broad-based deliberative body of the UN, where all member states engage, having hopefully what we will have in a couple of weeks, a resolution on the same topic, and as Tim's outlined, really will resolve the matter, let's say, in terms of the issue of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And that creates so many also important opportunities for UNDP to reinforce our work in a rights-based way. So it's very exciting. And of course, this momentum started at the council, which I think reinforces why, you know, it's important that we're engaging there. And thank you, Tim, for mentioning that. So that's really just a really great example to finish this first briefing off. So we haven't done briefings like this before after the council sessions. We've been sending out these detailed reports, but we know colleagues have challenges reading so many documents, and we don't always expect they'll have time to do so. I would mention the executive summary is only 4 pages and it includes a table, so it's quite short. So if you're going to read anything to get a snippet and a flavour of UNDP's engagement, that would be the document I would go to, and within that are hyperlinked all the various sessions, so you can then link to the session on the panel on good governance and digital, or the session on climate change, or any of the other sessions that the colleagues spoke to, and quite a few more actually as well that we didn't speak to today. So the next session of the council is going to be in September. This will be the 51st session. It's going to be from the 13th of September to the 7th of October. And we'll be circulating usually about 2 weeks in advance the agenda. We can't usually circulate it much more than that because it's not out. But at that time, we'll be circulating the agenda and trying and working with teams to point to the sessions that we'll be covering. We obviously have limited resources and we can't and don't want to cover everything. And also looking at the sessions where UNDP has a strategic where we have a strategic focus where we want to emphasize our work. So if there's anything in that agenda that you're interested in, you want to know more about, or you're interested in sharing your experience, let us know. And as I say, we have a mechanism to deliver the statements, and we can work with your teams on how to do that and really bring UNDP's development voice to the forefront of the council discussions on human rights. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So with that, I want to thank the colleagues, particularly Rakaya and Michelle, who are the ones that follow so many of the sessions and write such excellent and detailed overviews. Thank you so much for that tremendous amount of work. And also, obviously, our Geneva office in general, including our director, who does a great deal as well for UNDP's advocacy and voice at the council sessions. And thanks to Tim and Jamie for sharing your perspectives. And hopefully we'll do this again after the next session, if it's useful for colleagues. So thank you again.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, colleagues. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Sure.
colleagues. Bye.